Rain spattered across the sand, causing a deafening roar, like that of 100 semis crashing in. Rain spattered across the sand, causing a deafening roar, like that of 100 semis crashing into each other in apocalyptic glory. The crack of thunder split the insanity, and the wind swept it up with a cacophony of natural horror. All the while, David sat glumly, shielding himself from the gale beneath a rather large tree. He was soaked to the bone and miserable, lost in Kanto with no map, no Pokedex, no food, and no company other than his beloved Pokemon. He was sure he'd die of hypothermia or worse. David sighed, clinging tightly to his umbrella, which proved of little worth except for some sort of moral booster. His soaked blonde hair clung tightly to his body. With an absent hand, he fondled the Pokeballs on his lap. He clicked the switch on the front, releasing Gardevoir to stand beside him. "Guard?" she whispered to him soothingly. "No, I'm fine, Gardevoir. I just wanted some to be with," he replied, barely audible to the young Pokemon above the ripping winds. A shallow tear formed on the rim of his red eyes, but was blotted out the rest of the water that coagulated on everything within sight. She patted his shoulder. She was so cute, even for a Pokemon. Her thin hips swayed, her plant-like hair messed up by the storm. No, what are you doing? He thought. She's an animal. But yet, she was so much like a human, only smaller and covered in fauna. Plus, there was no one around for miles, and no amount of masturbation could sustain the lust he felt out in the wilderness. If only he could feel the flesh of a woman against his. He put his loving arm around his Gardevoir, pulling her close, and whispered, "Gardevoir, you know I'm your trainer, right? Your master?" "Guard." She nodded in agreement. He nodded in return. "And you would do anything for me." "Guard." She nodded again. He moved another hand to her, sliding it over her wasp waist, and looking carefully into her eyes. She seemed to begin to understand. A look of fear welled in her eyes. David could feel a lump in his pants swell as he began to force her upon the soaked ground. The sky rumbled with thunder all around them. The trees above them creaked threateningly. In a flash, his pants were off, and he was atop her. She squealed and struggled, afraid to fight back because he was, indeed, her trainer. Her mind had a block in it. Via years of training, years of believing he'd never harm her, that he was her best friend. He ran a hand over her leafy posterior. A probing finger slipped in between, finding a hole. He knew little of the Gardevoir anatomy, but he knew that any hole would work. He plunged his rock-hard cock deep inside her anus. It was white hot. A wave of pleasure washed over him before the first stroke. Gardevoir screamed in pain, her precious anus being pulled to 4 times its natural size. With each thrust, she screamed louder. But David couldn't hear it. The crevasse formed tightly over his shaft, gripping harder than his fist ever could. Before long, he finally came, filling her sphincter with his seed, white mixed with black blood, as he pulled out. Blood and feces dribbled out. The sight of Gardevoir laying there, whimpering, smeared with mud blood cum in her own feces, unlocked something deep within David's soul. His heart soared at the sight. It felt so good. It felt like he was finally discovered his place in the world. While his spirit had become free, however, his mind quivered under the weight of his actions, struggling to block these memories from existence, enabling his attack. His mouth lowered in primal instinct, extending his pink tongue, he lapped up her blood and shit, used pruned fingers to smother himself. It was beautiful. The bitter taste of her poop and the coppery taste of her blood was like magic to him. "Garv," she moaned, his hands digging in the dirt. She wept. How could she do this to him? Pain was splitting her because of him. He said he'd never hurt her, though maybe he wasn't. Maybe this was fine. He flipped her bleeding limp body over. His mouth met hers, lashing about inside of her toothed maw. He kissed her hard and deep as he carefully fit his shitty dick into her pokey vagina. The head slid in easily and she whimpered. With a deft hand, he massaged her clitoris. She tried to pull back to cry out, but he pushed her into her harder. She screamed into his mouth. The vibrations filled him with ecstasy. He violently penetrated her, and wave after wave of pleasure engulfed them both. It was beyond the realm of human understanding. Collapsing universes whirled about them, being born and dying in an eternal idiot firestorm. As he came again, he thrust harder, forcing as much of himself in as he could. His penis crashed into her cervix, and she let out a blood-curdling scream, clawed hands digging into his flesh. David didn't like that at all. No, she wasn't allowed to injure him. He drove his bleaching fist into her mouth. There was a crunch, and black syrup welled in her mouth and eyes. She gurgled and he smiled gleefully. Disengaged from her mangled secret, he crawled up to her face. Lifting her broken head, he plunged his dick into her wounded mouth. Guadava could take no more. She gave himself over to him. He was her master. She would please him in any way she could and never make another whimper in reply. She suckled on his piece as she pulled it in and out. Cracked lips smothered him, teasing glands and glands. He gripped her arms, squeezing tighter. More pain roared through her and she sucked harder. She gagged, puking a little. The bowel stung him, so he drove another fist into her eye. Through the pain, she sucked and finally he came. As he did, his mind cracked a little more. He gripped her head, forcing his cock into the back of her throat. She vomited again, squirting half-digested plant matter all over the both of them, and he lashed her, her tiny bones splintering under his blows, and he came harder at her destruction. Oh my God. Weeks later, David finally found himself at Cerulean City. Guadava wasn't looking very good. She didn't respond to vocal stimuli and couldn't see out of the eye he caved in. But he felt no remorse for it. Even so, he felt glad. She was mentally broken. His attack had transformed her into the perfect sex slave. Except the whole... Okay. When he moved his cock near her, she would tilt her head, trying to find it, just as a baby searches for a nipple, and automatically begin suckling. She was affected, though. Mold grew upon her anus and wounded eye. Her vagina was yellow with infection, discharging constantly. She wouldn't make it another day. David rushed to the Pokemon Center, Guadava in his arms. He came up to the reception desk, and there was Nurse Joy. Her eyes first went to David's thumb. What? Her eyes first went to David's dumb, smiling face, and then down to the Pokemon in his arms. She gasped. "What happened?" she said, stroking Guadava's hair with gentleness of a mother. "I'm not exactly sure," he muttered coldly. "I found her like this out in the forest." Tears formed in Joy's eyes, and she scooped the poor Pokemon up, taking her over to the rejuvenation chamber for dying Pokemon in another room. After flipping the switch, the chamber filled with gases, obscuring outside eyes. Joy didn't mind that David had followed her in and closed the door. She was too busy studying a complicated-looking readout, now appearing on the computer screen. She bent over low as she typed slowly. A complete novice with computers, it appeared. And as she did, her skirt teased her thick ass. Her thighs squeezed her legs delightfully. She was a delicious woman, and David would have no problem finding out just how delicious she was. He slid up next to her. "How's it look, nurse?" he asked, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Not very good. I'm afraid the rejuvenation chamber won't be enough for... Not the Pokemon. You're cut." At this, the nurse spun around. A hurt look flashed across her face as she bit her lip. She wasn't exactly sure how to handle this situation. It was true that she was constantly horny. She never had the time for anything outside of the hospital. Her cunt tingled at the prospect of being split. She eyed the door. Should she run? Should she have sex with this complete stranger? He seems dangerous, she thought. She thought. But as she did, her thighs pressed against themselves, pinching her enlarging clitoris. David's hands began to unbutton her blouse, revealing a polka-dotted bra clasping two Melon's side breast. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the office," she said with as much courage as she could muster, but didn't stop him. He pushed her up against the computer terminal and mouthed her nipples. She gasped as he bit one, teasing it with his tongue. He sucked on it and she lurched, not noticing her hand slide down to his hips. He lifted her and placed her upon the desk, her legs spread, and she leaned back, forgetting that she was on the rag, and gave herself to him. He lowered himself to a knee, ripping off her clashing blue underwear and exposing her rosy, dripping hole. He gently tugged on the string sticking out, drawing a blood-soaked tampon out. Oh my God. It fell to the floor. Thick chunks began to seep out. Holy fuck. She burned for this complete stranger. His fingers moved towards her, rubbing the rough spot just inside the warm tunnel. His red tongue slathered her clit. He sucked on it and hummed. A dizzy buzzing feeling filled her head and she began bucking, screaming in pleasure. Soon her screams of pleasure became those of pain as she forced 3 fingers into her tight pussy. She hadn't been with a man in so long. "No, please," she gasped at her vagina. Slowly spread and grew used to the probing digits. He inserted another finger and she gasped. This time her cunt burned in protest, showing no signs of widening. She squeaked. He forced another finger in, and soon began fisting her, plunging his large, manly hands in as far as they would go, spreading her wider, filling her. "More," she growled through clenched teeth, thick streams of saliva going down her cheeks. "Fuck me hard, you piece of shit." David didn't like this, however, and punched her in the gut. She lurched forward and gasped, but then weighing how much fun he was having with being told what to do, he decided to insert his next fist. What? Her tendons popped and squeaked as he forced the other ones inside slowly. Her cleft opened wider and wider still. She screamed in pain and pleasure until her throat bled almost as much as her cunt. Blood streamed down his arms, mixing with her cum, until his shirt and the floor were soaked. There was a knock at the door, followed by the turning of a handle. In strode the doctor the nurse had called for earlier, her father. He stopped, shocked at the situation that unfolded in front of him. What are you doing? What are you doing to my little girl?" "Oh, what are you doing to my little girl?" he murmured. "Shut the fuck up, you old bastard, and get the fuck over here. Her mouth isn't gonna fuck itself," David shouted, forcing his voice above that of Nurse Joy's. She was horrified that her father had walked in on this, horrified at all the blood and what she had been coerced into. But she couldn't stop. Lust raged inside of her, overtaking all other motor functions. "Fuck me, Daddy," she said, grinning a bloody smile. Her pleading eyes met his, and before she knew it, her father's wrinkly, liver-spotted dick was in her mouth. The doctor fucked her from the opposite side of the table. Her young tongue slid over the top of his dick, teasing the helmet. Calls it a helmet? He bucked wildly, shakily. He had not had sex since his wife had died 10 years ago, and sometimes he had dreams about his daughter. Oh my! He tried to ignore them, pushed them to the back of his mind, but he could never help his sick fantasies. Sometimes he'd accidentally walk in on her dressing or showering, and would think about it later that night as he choked himself and petted his shriveling member. David began to grow bored. His maniacal Slowly splintering mind needed more horror to sustain it. It was a curse, but one he enjoyed. He drew one hand out of her weeping puss, much to her protest. With the other, he gripped her cervix and twisted. Pain cut her, and she clenched her teeth and moaned, cleanly chopping her father's dick off as he clearly chopping her father's dick off as he came. The doctor fell backwards, and the nurse sat up straight, her vision blurred from the pain, but she was just barely able to see what David was doing. He had drawn a knife out of his pocket, his pocket, and driven it into his. He had drawn a knife out of his pocket and driven it into his urethra. His cock opened. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. His cock opened wide and he screamed, but kept pushing hard down into his ball sack. Blood gushed forward and he puked, bile adding to the horrendous pain, but he couldn't stop. Slowly, memories of him and Gardevoir flooded back. All the fun they had back home. Memories of his mother and father. How they wanted him to succeed. They wanted him to come home to spend time with their baby boy. Of his first love, the girl he never got over. Her name was Misty. She wanted to see him again. She had sent him a letter only a month earlier saying she wanted to be with him again. That nothing felt the same without him. What was he doing here? He couldn't stop his hands. They moved on their own, twisting out Joy's cervix bit by bit and slitting his genitals. At last, the leathery bag was open. They gripped his testicles and pried them out, forcing them into his mouth. All three parties bled to death. It was in the news the next day. The Gardevoir recovered, but was forever in a tortured state of slavery. My God. Misty shook as she read it. She wept and her mind grew jaded and hateful. She was alone in the world now. Nobody she loved. Nothing. Alone. She drew a Pokeball from her belt and opened it. Staryu appeared next to her. Staryu, she blushed, and looked at him through teary eyes. Would you do anything for me? Star, he echoed. Her cunt burned. She needed it.